When it comes to the discussion of the survival horror genre, there's always one game brought up in the conversation. One that was revolutionary in its presentation, mechanics, and polish. Of course, it wasn't the first game to do many of the things it did, but the quality of the genre had never been heightened to such an insane degree that the entire gaming industry took notice, whether it be Konami's Team Silent, Japan Studios' Project Siren, or From Software. Many developers saw the success of this game and decided to do their own thing inspired by it. It even managed to spawn an entire series that has since influenced games outside of Japan, and it's a common example of one of the best-selling and most critically acclaimed video game franchises of all time. But it all started with the 1996 original. Honestly, it's really hard to overstate Resident Evil's influence. It's one of the most iconic games ever made, with one of the most iconic directors in the gaming industry. And it's crazy when you look back on the game and realize that it was originally going to be a remake of Sweet Home, a game about characters stuck in a house who have to escape. Based on the movie, of course. But as development progressed, the team decided to spin off the project into its own game, but with a similar premise of police officers stuck in a mansion with zombies and other creatures. The interesting thing about this game is how its development would end up completely changing the structure of how Capcom would make their games. Before Resident Evil, Capcom didn't really have directors who would steer the project. They of course had managers and people at the top, but it wasn't directed the same way you would direct a movie, for example. But due to how successful Shinji Mikami's vision for the game was and how beneficial his structure was to the overall development of the game, Capcom strongly adapted this structure to all of their future projects. Many developers within the industry got their start with this game. Hideki Kamiya, who was known as the creator of Devil May Cry and Bayonetta, as well as Beautiful Joe, Okami, and The Wonderful 101, got his start on Resident Evil 1 as the lead designer. Yasuhiro Ampo, who has gone on to direct some of the most critically acclaimed entries in the franchise, started as a software engineer on this game. However, despite how successful the game was, Mikami was always a little disappointed. Mainly because the limitations of the PlayStation prevented him from truly making the game he wanted to make. Which is why 6 years later, in 2002, a remake of Resident Evil was made for the GameCube, which featured many of the same staff from the original game, including Mikami himself in the director chair. The remake sought to create the game Mikami wanted to make in 1996, but without the limitations of the PlayStation, featuring overhauled graphics, character models, environments, mechanics, voice acting, and music. Whilst received extremely well, and considered to this day as one of the greatest remakes of all time, it was unfortunately a GameCube exclusive. And if you know anything about the GameCube, you would know it was a commercial failure, meaning that the game unfortunately suffered, as it was part of an exclusivity deal that Capcom had with Nintendo at the time regarding Resident Evil. Even Mikami himself was very disappointed with how badly it sold as a result. Thankfully, the game was re-released in 2015 for every system under the sun at that time, and the sales skyrocketed. The remaster for Resident Evil 1 Remake ended up becoming Capcom's best-selling digital title of all time, selling 4.2 million copies on the PlayStation 3 alone. Unfortunately, the numbers for the other systems have not been released, but that would probably bump up that number quite a bit. So let's take a look back at Resident Evil, both the 1996 original and the 2002 remake, and see how a game that seeks to accomplish a lot of the same goals and has a lot of the same staff involved can change within 6 years. The core gameplay of Resident Evil is finding a way to escape the Spencer Mansion, but as the game goes on, there's more behind this strange place than meets the eye. The game is a sort of maze with different pathways and unlockable shortcuts that the player has to navigate, whilst solving puzzles and dealing with monsters within. However, unlike an actual maze, this game has rooms with unique layouts and visual design to keep the different areas distinct, but also to not allow the player to get lost too easily. If you look at a map of the mansion, you'll notice how it's mostly one big circle, with 2 levels and a central hall in the middle which acts as a sort of bridge between locations. The general structure of the game is that you come up against an obstacle which requires an item to bypass it. You then explore the area looking for said item, making the game a fairly non-linear, interconnected experience. This can seem overwhelming at first, considering how intricate the design of the map is, but the game is smart with how it introduces itself to the player. The game first starts off in a safe environment, which allows the player to get adjusted to the movement controls. It then introduces the major threat of the game, being a zombie. This is to help you understand how they work as obstacles, often obstructing paths that you will either need to expend resources to clear or maneuver around. However, whilst in this early stage of the game, the number of paths the player can take is limited, such as locked doors. This decreases the chances of the player getting lost early on, as they can easily determine if they're going the correct way. For example, if a door's locked, then you should find the key and come back. Of course, as you find more keys, the number of pathways opens up, making it easier and faster to traverse, but by the time you reach this point, you'll have a good understanding of the map layout. And having the map be interconnected means that you're almost always moving forward, as opposed to going down a path, reaching a dead end, and then being forced backwards. Of course, that can still happen, but the game does not overuse that, and you never feel limited in terms of navigability. This structure is repeated throughout the game in 4 main areas: the mansion, the residence, the catacombs, and the lab, each with their own art design, level structure, and item combination, as well as level exploration needed to progress, thus keeping the formula fresh over the runtime. The first quarter of the game takes place in the mansion, requiring you to find 4 crests to unlock the pathway leading to the residence. What is awesome about this section is that you can collect the 4 crests in whatever order you want, allowing for player freedom and more replayability, as you're not forced down the same order and paths each time. And it's a solid way to start the game, as the player can basically go wherever they want to in the mansion and still be making progress, since it's intended for the player to circle around and sweep the place. Aside from the main items, the player can also find other useful items such as health items to recover from enemy attacks and ammo for weapons, which allows you to deal with enemies you previously wouldn't be able to, or take more risks avoiding them. You can also find map scrolls to help fill in the map, though the map does fill in by itself when you explore, so it's not needed, but it does help give you a head start. And each crest has a unique way to obtain it, such as destroying a statue, solving a painting puzzle, or fighting a giant snake. It prevents the game from just being a stale, go here and collect item to progress structure, because there are activities included with gathering items. Plus, there being 2 levels to the mansion adds verticality to the game and prevents it from just being a flat maze, and the mansion has 3 different areas where you can ascend or descend, making it fairly convenient if you want to get to someplace quickly. However, it's not immediately said what the goal is when you first start the game. You'll be collecting these crests without any real idea of what they're used for, unless you go to the door beforehand. The game really could have made it more clear what the end goal is here. The residence isn't as open-ended as the mansion, but includes stronger and more aggressive enemies to act as obstacles. They're not as easy to dodge as zombies, so trying to look for items or puzzle clues becomes harder when being chased. There are still zombies here though, and you're in tighter corridors, so it's harder to avoid them. Plus, the puzzles in this section are more difficult than anything in the mansion. They aren't super complex, but they are fun little minigames to add some variety during exploration. Plus, there's a section where you're running through water up to your torso, slowing you down, whilst escaped sharks chase you. It's a fun section that manages to add tension to the game and make the player feel at a disadvantage without changing the core mechanics or making it too frustrating to get through. And it's very satisfying to drain the water afterwards and see the enemies that were just posing a credible threat to you now unable to touch a hair on your head. After the residence, you head back to the mansion with tougher enemies and explore new areas. It's a great use of backtracking as it's given the player something they're familiar with, thus not requiring them to adjust to an entirely new level, whilst also not just straight up reusing content, and making the journey tougher this time around. After your second visit to the mansion, you enter the catacombs, which is my least favourite part of the game. First of all, it's almost exclusively made up of hunters, which can be annoying with how easy it is for them to stunlock you and kill you instantly. Plus, in terms of structure, it's the most uninteresting. It's basically just a straight line that you keep going in. There's not any interesting puzzles, and since exploration is non-existent, it pretty much relies on your interactions with the enemy to be entertaining, which they aren't for reasons I'll talk about later. Plus, there's a boss with this giant spider that has unfair attacks that come out before the player can react to them. It doesn't play to the game's strengths, that being exploration and dealing with obstacles, instead just relegating it to an enemy gauntlet. Luckily, it's the shortest part of the game. The final section is the lab. The lab is a pretty good send-off to the game as it has the circular navigability of the mansion without being as open-ended, instead focusing more on puzzles. The best way to describe it is as a compromise between the mansion and the residence. It also requires the player to keep a keen eye out for disc readers. During the events of both campaigns, the other protagonist is locked in a cell. For Jill's campaign, Chris is in the cell, and vice versa. You could ignore them and go about your day, but doing so will lead to that character's death. If you want to save them, then you'll have to find MO discs hidden around the mansion, the underground, and the lab. And then you will need to find the disc readers in the lab to open the door. However, this can be tedious to do if you missed the discs, as you will be required to go all the way back to the mansion, which requires you to go all the way back through the catacombs. Overall though, the gameplay structure is very engaging, with the player having to find ways to overcome obstacles as they explore more of the estate, with varying levels of difficulty, enemy variety, and challenges. Despite the game's age in other aspects, its gameplay still stands strong in this regard. None of the other Resident Evil games have as good level design as Resident Evil 1 does. Resident Evil 2's is good, but you're more railroaded down certain paths, and there's a bit too many dead ends for my liking. Resident Evil 3 is the closest with its more open nature in the Raccoon City streets, but other areas fall into a more linear design structure. Revelations had a big interconnected level, in fact it's probably the biggest interconnected level in the series, but due to the lack of an inventory system there was very little reason to ever backtrack in that game. You pretty much only ever needed to go where the game tells you. Resident Evil 7 did this decently, but also had a more cinematic approach to its gameplay and certain sections, which impacts how you progress through the levels, sometimes in a negative way. I will talk more in depth about these games at some point, but you get the idea. In fact, I don't think I've ever seen a horror game with a level as well designed as the Spencer Mansion, with multiple pathways, verticality, non-linear progression, good enemy placement, and so forth. In terms of level design and structure, this game is actually aged pretty damn well. But how does the remake handle these aspects? First of all, the mansion is just a flat-out improvement. The opening of the game is now structured in a way to railroad you down a path until you reach this new area where you need to collect 4 masks to progress, serving the same purpose as the crests in the original, but introducing the player to them right away so as to not cause any confusion with what the player is meant to be doing or be looking for. Then it gives you a key and allows you to explore the mansion looking for the masks in whatever order you want and at your own pace. Not only that, but new rooms have been added which either act as new shortcuts, thus giving the map more density, or provide items. Plus, a lot of existing locations have been reworked so as to flow better with how the player progresses through them. For example, the area in which you find Forest is now expanded to look more like an actual balcony and gives you some items, or the courtyard, which can act as a shortcut to the safe room after you've collected one of the masks. There's also a new staircase on the left side that can take you upstairs, which also leads to a new mirror room, which acts as a shortcut between the upper left balcony of the dining room and the safe room on the lower level, which also has a balcony on the outside, providing a passage to the main hall. These additions make so much sense and work so well with the mansion's design that I often question if they were always intended to be there, but just didn't make the cut in the original. The mansion is just an overall improvement. It keeps the structure and progression of this section intact, whilst also making it more understandable and giving the player more options in terms of movement. Unfortunately, the residence is a downgrade in my opinion. The level design and puzzles are kept intact, but the spiders are just much less dangerous in the remake, which removes challenge and tension from exploring the area. To be fair, the spiders in the original did have attacks and patterns that were insanely quick and aggressive, which all but forced you into combat with them, so I do understand nerfing them a bit, but please make them put up a challenge, come on. They also kept this section where you move boxes, and I really don't understand why. This is already a fairly slowly paced game, so it's not as if it needs a slower section to allow the player some breathing room or anything. It just makes the pace crawl whilst you just sit there waiting for your character to move the boxes into the water. I really don't see any benefit the game gets from this. It does pick up when you head into the shark pool though. You avoid the sharks at first, thinking it's over, but then bam, they start trying to burst the place open, and you have to work with janky technology to get the shutter doors to close before you die. You also do still have the satisfaction of draining the water and seeing them helpless. In fact, in this version, it's even better, because you get to electrocute the giant shark, which can one-hit kill you. The catacombs start off similar, with you in linear sections with hunters, but it's still an improvement as 1, the hunters are actually fair and balanced in this game, and 2, they added a new section where you have to navigate around an enemy whilst trying to open a door within a time limit, thus adding a unique kind of challenge to the game. The lab is mostly the same. The puzzles are similar but with different solutions, so that you can't just cheat if you've already played the original. Thankfully, a big improvement is the ammo discs. 2 of the 3 discs are already in the laboratory, so the only one the player could have missed is in the mansion. And thankfully, Capcom made the mansion and the catacombs separate, and therefore it's easy to obtain in this version if you missed it. The only addition to this section that I dislike is this section where you have to carry a capsule that is very fragile. Running or being attacked whilst carrying it results in an explosion and a game over. During the first playthrough this can be tense, but during the second playthrough onward, it's not hard to just empty the room full of enemies beforehand and then just walk through, making it an arbitrary slow walk section. This is unless you abuse the run mechanics to get through it. Otherwise though, I think the remake does a fantastic job of updating existing locations, but adding more depth to them. For returning players, it will provide the same experience they love, but more refined and better designed. And for new players, it provides quality of life improvements that emulates the experience of the original game to a T, but also doesn't emulate some of the bigger flaws. The remake, just like its predecessor, has timeless level design and structure that few games since have matched, let alone surpassed. It's the blueprint that many developers use when designing a horror game, and that speaks volumes to how well it impressed the world and continues to do so. Running around a maze isn't the only part of Resident Evil's design. As you progress through these areas, you'll encounter a variety of monsters that all pose a different challenge to the player. The most common one being zombies. They're slow and make loud noises, making them easy to counter and deal with. The problem with them is not so much how hard it is to take them down, but more the logistics of it. Killing zombies in this game is pretty easy, but it requires ammo to do so. Ammo that could be spared for later encounters. You could try and use the knife, but it's not very effective for combat. The knife is pretty much only in the game, so that you can't get soft-locked on bosses. So this gives the player a few options depending on the situation. If a zombie is blocking your path, you can use one of your guns and clear it. You can decide in the situation what weapon would be the best to use and what ammo you could spend on them. For example, pistol ammo is more plentiful but not as effective. So if you don't have as much room to maneuver, then you could end up getting grabbed, especially since you can't move whilst attacking. The shotgun has the ability to one-hit kill zombies, but you have to wait until they're right up in your face to do so, and ammo is more scarce. Same with the Magnum and the grenade launcher. They both do a lot of damage, but they have little ammo. Alternatively, you could try and dodge the zombie as you go past, but it is extremely easy to get grabbed in this game. So whilst the most rewarding, as it has the best benefits, it's also the most risky. In some cases though, especially in the mansion, there may be an alternate route to get where you need to go, but it could take longer or have more dangerous enemies. So you already have several options on how to deal with zombies, but what makes the decision making even more interesting is the inventory limit, as Jill can only carry 8 items, and as Chris, you can only carry 6, and everything in this game takes up an inventory slot. If you want a weapon, that takes up 1. Oh, but you want ammo of that weapon? That's another slot. You want to carry a health item? That's another slot. If you want to carry a main story item needed to progress, that's also another slot. So whilst it is possible to just fill your inventory full of guns and ammo, it's a terrible idea to do so unless you're in a boss fight. You'll have to make a choice of what's the best items to bring with you in any given situation. You could not bring the ammo and leave another slot open, but that gives you less fighting options if you run out of ammo. So there's still a trade-off. Plus, even though you can carry multiple weapons at once with either character, you'd probably also want to carry a health item in case you get hurt. And if you're carrying a main story item, that would also reduce your options as well. Plus, you would naturally want to reduce the amount of back and forth travels you do in this game, so that's why planning out your routes and what items you'll take with you is a smart idea. It cuts down on a lot of the busy work. And since you do have a map screen that fills in and you can find map scrolls, you can preemptively plan what you're going to do and where you're going to go. And this is where most of the decision making in Resident Evil comes from, planning out the route you're going to take, what to take with you, and if you come up against any obstacles, how you'll deal with them. Being good in combat is more about managing your positioning to maximize the effectiveness of your weapons and managing resources as opposed to being good with aiming. Health items can also be combined to make them more effective. Throughout the game, you can find blue, green, and red herbs. Green heal you, blue cure any poison, and red do nothing by themselves, but when combined with a green herb, heal you considerably more. You can also combine blue and green to heal you and cure you at the same time. This also adds more decision making to healing, as you could use a green herb by itself if you're desperate for health, but if you're patient and willing to risk it, you could wait until you find a red herb, which will make the healing more effective, and it will clear up inventory space too. Thankfully, the process of managing the inventory is fairly easy to do, as the game includes safe rooms. These are rooms that are completely void of enemies, allowing the player to take a breather, but there's also the option to save and use the item box. Typewriters save your game by using an ink ribbon. Without them, you can't save, and there is a limited number of them throughout the game. This prevents players from just spamming save to avoid any challenge or difficulty. There are plenty of ribbons throughout the game, but you still have to find them, so if you don't explore much or save too often without pre-planning, then you can find yourself out of the option to save. Which I think is smart design because, as I said, it encourages the players to plan out their paths and saves as opposed to just spamming save every time you go to the safe room. The item box allows the player to store items they no longer need or put away items for further use, such as weapons, health, or key items. Originally, during development, the item boxes were going to have their own separate inventory, meaning that if you placed a shotgun in a certain box, for example, and wanted to retrieve it, you would have to go to that specific box. This was later changed in development, and the team made all of the boxes share the same inventory due to playtester frustration, thus making the retrieval of items no longer tedious while still helping to reinforce the inventory management. However, getting back to the enemies, facing only zombies would get old, so the game has enemy variety to spice things up. In addition to zombies, you can also find zombie dogs. They're much faster than zombies and can easily overwhelm you, but they don't deal as much damage and have less health, so they're not unfair. You have giant spiders which can shoot poison at you and deal damage quickly and fast. Poison can be cured with blue herbs as mentioned. Poison will gradually cause your health to fall until it reaches 1%. It can't kill you by itself, but leaving it alone will cause issues for you in the long run. About halfway through the game, hunters are introduced, and they're the most dangerous non-boss enemy in the game. They are very fast, deal a lot of damage, and have a lot of health. They can instantly kill you and can outmaneuver most of your attacks easily. To be honest, I don't think the hunters are balanced in a way that makes the game fun. Yes, they are supposed to be threatening, but having an enemy that can take 4 shotgun shots to kill, meanwhile it has an instant kill move that comes out quickly, is a bit much. This is part of the reason why the catacomb section is the worst part. You have little room to maneuver and have to fight multiple hunters back to back. The Chimera only appear in the lab section and are meant to take the player by surprise, as they mostly stay on the ceiling waiting for a surprise attack and trying to blend in with the environment. They're very underutilized if I'm honest. The idea of an enemy acting as more of a predator is interesting, and I wish the game used them more. As it is, they're only used in 3 rooms back to back. Otherwise though, I'd say the enemy selection is well varied and provides unique challenges. Chris and Jill's campaigns mostly provide a similar experience, but there are some differences other than cutscenes. Jill has a lockpick which automatically allows her to get through certain doors, whereas Chris will have to carry a small key to open them. Jill can also skip one of the boss fights that Chris is required to fight, and during a certain puzzle involving a piano, she can play the piano by herself, thus instantly progressing, whereas Chris needs Rebecca to learn how to play first. Jill's only disadvantage is that she's weaker on health and dies easier than Chris. Chris can take more damage, but he doesn't get the grenade launcher. He does get a flamethrower, which just sucks. It's not very fun or satisfying to use. Chris also gets 2 small sections in his campaign where you get to play as Rebecca and help Chris out. This adds a lot of replay value to the game and provides 2 different experiences. Jill is more of a laid-back approach to playing the game, whereas Chris is the real survival horror experience. In terms of the actual player mechanics, this is the part of Resident Evil which has always had some contention. The game infamously has tank controls, which operate in the way of up on the D-pad moving the character forward, down on the D-pad making them walk backwards, and left and right steering the character in either direction. This is different from other games at the time, and especially now, where the directional inputs simply move you in that direction. A lot of people dislike this style of control, as it means that moving around enemies is difficult, as you have to steer your character around them, as opposed to just moving in the exact pattern that you want. I've even heard some people go as far as to say that this is bad game design, as it means that the challenge comes from bad controls. Now, I actually can understand the dislike of tank controls, but the notion that it's bad game design is something that I find absurd. Every enemy's hitbox, grabs, attacks, speed, and placement is made with the controls in mind. For example, the zombies are intentionally slow so that the player can properly move and adjust to their position. Plus, the attack hitboxes of enemies is surprisingly very small, and most attacks can be reliably avoided by running away. Even enemies with fast attacks, such as dogs or hunters, have a small recovery window after an attack to allow the player to retaliate. Some people also don't like the fact that you can't move and shoot, but the point of this is to provide a risk-reward style to the gameplay. The weapons in this game are quite powerful, but in order to use them, you have to give up movement, and that makes the player really prioritize positioning and maximizing the usefulness of their guns. This is also another reason why the fast enemies have short breaks between attacks, so if the player wants to readjust their position, they have a small window to do so. Also, aside from a single boss fight, any projectile-based attacks are very telegraphed and have a wind-up, allowing the player to reposition if needed. You may not like this style of game design, but to say it's bad design is provably false. The entire design is made with how the characters control in mind. If the enemies and environments were designed in a different way, such as Tomb Raider or Quake, then you would have a fair argument. But that's clearly not the case here. Plus, I disagree with the notion that controls shouldn't contribute to a game's difficulty. Of course, it has to be within reason, but every game puts limitations on the character controls for the sake of balance. Shinji Mikami and his team could have made Jill and Chris move twice as fast, or make them move and shoot at the same time if they wanted to, but they decided that it would go against the goals of the game. Also, on a side note, I find it funny how people constantly talk about how Resident Evil 4 is one of the greatest games ever made, and I agree, but it uses almost the exact same PlayStation 1 tank controls. So if it's a problem, why does nobody complain about it in that game, but they complain about it in this game? I don't mind if people like or dislike tank controls, but be consistent, please. However, despite my defense of tank controls, there are still problems. For one, you have to manually aim your gun at targets. Due to the fixed camera perspective, it can often be hard to tell if you're aiming at the target. Thankfully, this was addressed in the director's cut, which made the guns auto-lock to enemies, and every game afterwards adopted this. As I said, the challenge in this game does not come from aiming, so requiring the player to aim in a fixed perspective where there's very little indication on what they're aiming at, such as a laser sight for example, then yes, it can be annoying, especially when you're fighting hunters. So yes, there are still a few problems with the controls of the game. The remake largely keeps Resident Evil's mechanics and gameplay style intact whilst adding or tweaking elements. The weapons all largely work the same way as the original. What is different about how the weapons work in this game is crit chances. In most games, the way crit chance works is that every shot fired at an enemy has a percentage to deal critical damage. The remake sort of does this, but in a different way. The remake picks a number from a range and then determines that shot being the critical one. So, for example, it might randomly pick the number 17, meaning that the 17th shot from a pistol is a 100% guaranteed critical shot. The game also doesn't pick any number below 11. The reason the game is designed this way is so that you are guaranteed to get a critical shot at some point, but it also can't be abused. The reason it takes at least another 10 shots before a critical chance happens is to prevent the player popping multiple zombie heads back to back. Chris actually has an advantage here, as his range of shots required for a critical hit is lower than Jill's. Also, during boss fights, Chris aims down the iron sights with the shotgun instead of hip firing, which actually does speed up his firing speed, giving him another advantage over Jill. Another addition to the remake is defensive items. If you get grabbed from the front, you have a way to stop yourself from taking damage. This allows the player to attempt more risky maneuvers of trying to move around enemies without being immediately punished for doing so. Of course, they have limited use, so you can't spam them, and if you get grabbed from behind, then you can't use a defensive item, but it does make it less frustrating to get past zombies, as well as making enemies like dogs or hunters more fair. Speaking of which, hunters have been nerfed to be more balanced. They don't have as much health, making combat with them more viable, and their one-hit kill move is now much more telegraphed and has a bigger wind-up. They can even ascend to higher levels in the mansion if you try to outrun them. It makes the catacombs more fun and less frustrating. Enemies can also switch rooms and bust down doors, so sometimes leaving an enemy alive can actually be quite a big hindrance. Probably the most iconic change to enemies in this game is the addition of Crimson Heads. Unlike the original, when you kill a zombie, its body will still remain on the floor. Now, you might at first assume that this is just the extra power of the GameCube that allows it to keep the zombies rendered on screen, but there's an actual gameplay mechanic behind this. If you leave a dead zombie unattended for too long, it comes back as a crimson head, which is faster and stronger and a pain to put down. You can deal with them by either exploding the zombie's head to begin with, thus completely avoiding the chance of them ever being a crimson head, or you can burn the body shortly after you kill them. It makes backtracking and exploring existing areas really fun, because if you didn't deal with any of the zombies before, you might be punished for doing so. The controls have also been improved. The game still utilizes tank controls, but it incorporates the auto-aim from the director's cut, as well as featuring a quick turn option. You are stationary whilst doing it, but it makes changing directions for whatever reason much quicker and more responsive. However, there is a problem. In 2015, the 2002 game was remastered for modern systems, and it included an alternate control scheme for players who really dislike tank controls. It basically gives the game full analog stick movement, where the directional inputs push the player in the direction as opposed to steering the character. I'm not against the idea of analog being implemented, but it has two major problems. First of all, the game really was not designed with this control scheme in mind, and it shows. You have so much more freedom of movement over your character to the point of it breaking the game. You can bait out zombie attacks and move around them super easily since there's no restriction on movement anymore, and you can instantly change direction. In the original, the slight delay of you turning around before you can move again was to allow the controls to be more fluid without disrupting enemy design or game flow. With full analog though, you can completely change directions and run at full speed within one frame, and enemies cannot do anything to combat this, making enemies and boss fights trivial. On top of that, it's actually more cumbersome than tank controls because of the way fixed cameras work. The camera angles can change frequently, and as such the character's position to the camera can change as well. This works with tank controls because tank controls are consistent no matter the angle. Up on the D-pad is always going to be the button to walk forward, for example, so it's not disorientating. With full analog though, it's possible for the camera to completely switch positions, meaning that the angle to move forward can also completely change. And sometimes you can accidentally get stuck in a loop if you try to reorientate yourself out of instinct. So it's a control scheme that simultaneously breaks the game, but is also annoying to use. I can understand why it was added. There's a lot of people who hate tank controls, and if this new control scheme got people to check out this game when they otherwise wouldn't have, then fair enough, I'm not going to stomp on their enjoyment. But I personally would never use this control scheme other than footage for this video. All in all, the original Resident Evil's enemies and gameplay mechanics are solid, but a bit unpolished, which can lead to moments of unfair balancing or tedium. The remake largely kept both of these aspects the same, but addressed the major issues, whilst adding new mechanics. As mentioned, part of the structure of Resident Evil is puzzles. It's not a full-on puzzle game, but it is one of the more identifiable parts of the game. They vary in complexity. Some are very simple, such as finding an item to place at a specific point. One example being the ceiling trap. If you try to take this shotgun off the stand, then the ceiling in the next room will start to fall on you and the door locks. If you are playing Jill's campaign and Barry hasn't finished searching the lower floor yet, then he can come and save you. But otherwise, you'll have to use a broken shotgun and place it on the stand in order to get out of the room. Another is finding gems to put in this statue to get items such as ammo or an ammo disc. The piano room requires you to find the complete musical sheet and then use a fake shield to avoid getting stuck. Most of the puzzles in the game are like this, so I won't spend time going through all of them. They aren't exactly going to challenge the mind, but they do provide more variety to how the player explores, as they would otherwise just be running around and shooting zombies. There are more sophisticated puzzles, such as the gallery room, which requires you to look at descriptions of paintings and arrange them in order of someone's lifespan. The armor room puzzle, which just requires you to move objects over vents to prevent gas. The V-Jolt puzzle, which is basically a mathematics puzzle. The lab puzzle, where you have to figure out passwords by emails, which allude to a character that will appear in the next game, and so on and so forth. Overall, the puzzles are very simplistic, but they do help add variety and break up the pace quite well. The remake, however, goes a bit more in depth with them. First of all, the puzzles that revolve around obtaining items have more steps. An example being the armor key, which requires you to obtain a fake key by using a dog whistle to call out a dog and take its collar, which has a fake key in it that you can use to put in the indentation and take the real key without being killed. Or the shield key, which requires solving a clock puzzle related to a painting. The gallery room is overhauled to now be a color matching puzzle. Some consider this a downgrade, and I can understand why, but it works better for replay value since solving this puzzle now only takes 3 buttons as opposed to 6 in the original. This puzzle with the vents has been overhauled to moving knights in a specific order. Even the lab puzzle has a different code to prevent you from cheating if you already played the original. V-Jolt is pretty much the same as the original though. But in addition to changing existing puzzles, the game also adds new ones. There's a new weather vane puzzle which requires you to move statues in the correct position to unlock a gate. There's a new puzzle where you have to arrange books in the correct order to unlock a door. There's a puzzle with the jewelry box where you have to arrange shapes, and a puzzle with a cylinder where you have to arrange the gears in the right configuration to get the button combination. Most of the puzzles are arranged puzzles now that I think about it. None of these are head scratchers, especially for 2002. This was after Silent Hill 1 and 2, for example, but the purpose of puzzles in Resident Evil games is to act as more of a pace breaker than a core gameplay element. So even if the puzzles in this game aren't exactly going to challenge you, they serve their purpose well enough, and I think the remake overall does a pretty decent job of updating the existing ones, whilst adding some of its own. Though one downgrade is moving this crate to block the tentacle. In the original, you just move the statue over the hole and the tentacle will never bother you. In the remake, you now have to climb over crates to get between places, and it adds nothing to the game other than wasting my time. Being a horror game, there has to be a strong sense of atmosphere in order to fully immerse the player in the setting and really sell the tension and panic. What I find interesting about the early era of Resident Evil, and this was probably due to the tech and not intentional, is that the environments are actually quite bright and colourful. Rooms are fully lit and everything is visible. The tension more comes from what is obscured by the camera as opposed to what's looming in the darkness. It reminds me of movies such as The Shining or Eyes Wide Shut and how they handle horror. Most of the rooms are fairly flat, with only the essentials needed to convey what type of environment the player is in. What adds to this is the very prominent soundtrack that is often slow and peaks in and out with melodies or keys. No matter where you are, there's always a looming dread hanging over the player. One of my personal favorite tracks plays in the guardhouse. It has both a sense of mystery and eeriness to it, and it's hard to explain with words. The enemies make iconic and identifiable sounds, and it's often the first thing you'll hear after entering a room, and it can put you on edge. There's a really oppressive feeling to the game, as if you're unwanted by the mansion and it's trying to throw you out. The sense of panic really kicks in during boss fights, thanks to how easily they can kill you. Plus the music pumps up the adrenaline. However, the game isn't all horror. In both Jill and Chris's campaigns, you do have a helper along the way with Barry and Rebecca, both of which help you in sticky situations, give you items, and can heal you. It reminds the player that they're not completely alone in this, and the moments you spend with these characters helps give a bit of a breather to a game where everything is trying to kill you. The music reflects this too. I think the most iconic piece of music in this game is the safe room theme. Safe rooms, as the name implies, are completely safe from outside force, which makes them a haven of comfort and peacefulness. But you will have to leave at some point, which is reflected in the soundtrack with its calm but foreboding sound. Despite being a game from 1996, there is a surprisingly solid atmosphere. I'd say the only thing that could break the immersion is the voice acting and cutscenes, but I'll get to that later. On just a pure gameplay level, it's pretty good in this regard. The 2002 game really went in regards to atmosphere. For starters, the game is a lot darker and there's a lot more contrast. The mansion itself has gotten an overhaul to being a creepy old place that is falling apart with corroded wood, cobwebs, scratched floor tiles, you name it. The mansion is packed with more detailed furniture and worn-down use. The original mansion came across as though it was brand new. This mansion shows that it was lived in and used for quite a while, which fits the story better too. It's not just the mansion though. The guardhouse and the lab also got overhauls to not only be more visually distinct and interesting, but to convey the use that these places had for the people involved. I am happy that they still preserve the general layout and look of the original areas with a darker style, and I love how the lighting is done in this game. Resident Evil 1 Remake has dark environments, but there's always nice light sources sprinkled throughout so as to keep the visibility from the original whilst making for a higher contrast game. What I love about the soundtrack too is that in addition to new tracks, many of the original game's tracks were remixed and remade to fit this darker style, and they sound great, giving music and an atmosphere that sounds familiar but also has a new feel to it. Both games have a good atmosphere, but the remake is the clear winner here. The game is not only more consistent with its narrative and setting, but also retains many qualities of the original. The mansion still feels oppressive, the nicer, quieter moments still hit, and the suspense and horror is still captured. The remake has one of the best and most memorable atmospheres in any video game, and there's a reason why many have tried to ape off the Spencer Mansion. It left such an impression on the people who played it. Both games fare pretty well in regards to replay value. For starters, having 2 campaigns means that the game is worth 2 playthroughs alone, and as mentioned, they both fit different styles of play despite being similar. If you manage to save the other protagonist in your playthrough, then you unlock new outfits that can be worn. Which outfit you get is determined by the version you're playing. My favourite is the PlayStation ones. Jill looks really good in black, and Chris has a jacket with a Queen reference. If you manage to beat the game without saving, then you can unlock the rocket launcher, and if you manage to beat the game in under 3 hours, then you get an unlimited rocket launcher. In the Sega Saturn version of the game, there was also Battle Game. Battle Game was sort of a precursor to the Mercenaries. You start out in the safe room and get to select what equipment you want from the item box. You then have to clear a room full of enemies before the timer runs out. You can even encounter a zombie Albert Wesker. I'm actually disappointed that this mode wasn't included in the remake. Maybe it was time constraints, but I would have loved to have seen it return. The funny thing is that Resident Evil Village's Mercenaries plays quite similar to this. However, the remake does have a lot, and I mean a lot, of content. First of all, both characters have 2 extra costumes, which requires you to play through their campaign twice to get both. Jill gets a military costume inspired by Linda Hamilton from Terminator 2, and her Resident Evil 3 design. Chris gets an outfit inspired by Brad Pitt from The Mexican, and his Code Veronica outfit. What is awesome though is that when Capcom re-released the game in 2015, they included Chris and Jill's BSAA outfits from Resident Evil 5, and they were completely free. They can look kind of weird because it's clearly just the character models from 2009 put into the game, but it's still awesome to have more costumes nonetheless, I'm not going to complain. I do wish some of the unused costumes were put into the game though, but what we have is nice. I mean look, Capcom, who do I have to whack to see Jill in this outfit? Apart from costumes, there's also 2 weapons you can unlock. The first is Barry's Samurai Edge, which fires faster than the normal pistol, has infinite ammo, and never needs to reload. You unlock this for beating the game in under 5 hours. The second is the Infinite Rocket Launcher, which you unlock the same way as the original, beat the game in under 3 hours. After completing both campaigns, you now get a new enemy, Bomb Zombie. He runs around and attacks the player, making a very distinct sound. But you can't attack him because if you do... KABOOM! There's also 2 extra modes to unlock, Real Survival and Invisible Enemy mode. Real Survival takes the beta gameplay of the 1996 game and turns it into a challenge mode. There's no lock-on and item boxes don't share items. After playing the game this way, I can definitely see why they didn't go with this style, but as a challenge mode, it is quite fun. Invisible Enemy mode makes all of the enemies invisible. You have to use shadows, reflections, and sound effects to figure out where the enemy is. And if you beat this mode in under 5 hours, you get a personal thank you from Shinji Mikami. Both games have a good incentive to continue playing even after you finish it, and Resident Evil has since become one of the most replayable franchises in gaming. Talking about the story in this game can prove rather difficult, as it's very simplistic, and the game heavily prioritizes the gameplay and atmosphere over its story content. In fact, both games only feature around 20 to 30 minutes of cutscenes for either campaign, and the average completion time ranges from 7 to 11 hours, which I can compliment as you'll be spending a lot more time playing the game than watching it. The basic premise of the game is that a bunch of weird murder cases in the fictional Raccoon City have cropped up, with people eating other people. This causes the Special Tactics and Rescue Service, STARS, to investigate. Bravo team is sent into the nearby forest to investigate, but communication with them is quickly lost. So Alpha team, comprised of Chris Redfield, Jill Valentine, Barry Burton, and Albert Wesker, are sent in to investigate. They find the crashed helicopter and are quickly attacked by dogs. They then run into a nearby mansion for refuge and try to find a safe way out. Most of the game from that point onwards until the lab is just trying to figure out how to escape the mansion. Over the course of the game, it's slowly revealed that Albert Wesker, the leader of Alpha Team, is actually working for Umbrella, a pharmaceutical company that is revealed to be involved with bioweapon experiments, and he lured his team here to the Spencer Mansion, which is secretly a facility used for bioweapon experiments as an exercise to test the creature's capability against trained police officers. The experiments were trying to create Tyrant, which Wesker calls the ultimate life form, which ends up being his downfall, funny enough. Tyrant is then defeated and you get one of 12 endings, which I'll talk about later. Plot-wise, both versions are very similar. The same events happen across both games. What differs is mainly the presentation. The original 1996 game has a very campy B-movie approach to how it presents the characters. Some of this is intentional, such as the opening introduction.
Chris Redfield. Jill Valentine. Barry Burton. Rebecca Chambers. Albert Wesker. Resident Evil.
I never get sick of watching this. Capcom, please go back to this, please. Other times it's unintentional, such as the terrible voice acting.
Whoa! What is it?
What? Oh! Oh no!
I love this style because it's clear that the game isn't taking itself very seriously and is mostly trying to be a homage to classic zombie films such as Dawn of the Dead. And despite not being intentional, the voice acting is absolutely hilarious.
Stop it! Don't open that door!
That was too close. You were almost a Jill sandwich.
You're right.
This house is dangerous. There are terrible demons. Ouch!
I can't believe it! Are you okay?
Yeah, so much for him. We got to the root of the problem.
That's right. This is the ultimate life form. Tyrant! Chris? Stop it.
Wesker, you're pitiful.
In another game, this might have been a detractor, but considering this is a silly game with giant monsters and over-the-top music, it only adds to the experience and makes the characters more memorable. It's honestly refreshing to play a game like this. A lot of horror games in the modern age, even modern Resident Evil games, really do try to sell the fact that they're going for a more serious direction, which isn't a bad thing by any means and makes sense in most cases, but I do miss when horror games were also simultaneously a comedy. Which leads into the presentation in the remake. The remake has a darker and more somber atmosphere, which works incredibly well for the game. The voice acting isn't spectacular, but it is an improvement.
What is this place?
Not quite your ordinary house, that's for sure.
Hey, Wesker, where's Chris?
Jill, no! You don't want to go back out there.
To detonation. The self-destruct system's activated.
Good work! Brad's up in the helicopter.
Those things are coming.
I'll take care of them.
But...
Chris, you just get in contact with Brad somehow.
Okay.
and most of the corny 90s stuff has been replaced with eerie sound effects. I think this direction works and accomplishes what it sets out to do. The campiness also isn't completely gone, as some cheesy lines and scenes did still make it in.
Phew. Barry.
That was a close one. A second late, you would have fit nicely into a sandwich.
Really?
The ultimate life form. Tyrant.
Wesker, you've become senile.
But as a whole, it's more toned down, and I have some gripes with this. On the one hand, it does make for a more consistent and better polished experience for the player. On the other hand, it's not as entertaining. Resident Evil 1 doesn't have much of an interesting plot to begin with, so when you remove all the corny lines and voice acting, you're just left with a very mediocre at best story. The characters and their personalities would be fleshed out in later entries, but in this game they're fairly standard. Chris is skillful and courageous. Jill is soft, calm, and tender. Rebecca is an upbeat doctor, and Barry is a more experienced police officer. And Wesker's the typical bad guy with sunglasses. There's really not much to say about them, and the remake doesn't add anything to their personalities. In both versions, Barry is revealed to have been blackmailed by Wesker to try and get Jill killed, but it backfires so badly. In the remake though, the fact that Barry is working for Wesker is so obvious. In the original, there's small signs that he's trying to hinder you, but they come across more as mistakes that he's making. Whereas in the remake you have full-on scenes where he's talking to different people that you can't see about the operation. I think this could have been adjusted to make it a little less obvious. Thankfully though, the story and lore behind this game was expanded upon in the remake. In the 1996 game, you can find and read documents giving some backstory to the mansion and how it's a front for the facility, but people still lived in it. In the remake, the George Trevor character and story was added. George Trevor was an architect that loved puzzles, and he was commissioned by Oswell E. Spencer to design the mansion, as Spencer enjoyed Trevor's style of design. Spencer even let them stay at the mansion as a way of thanks. Or so it would seem. One day, George woke up and his wife and daughter were missing. Spencer said that they were just going to visit a family member. But the more the days went on, the more he noticed things missing from the mansion, holes in the walls where there shouldn't be, and he even found his wife's shoes. He quickly realized that something was wrong, and he tried to escape before then being chased by Spencer's guards. He eventually managed to hide in a small room with a tombstone that had his name on it. Spencer had always planned to kill Trevor. He then died due to starvation and thirst. In regards to his wife and daughter, they were taken to the underground lab and used in experiments. The mother's experiments were deemed a failure and she was killed. They then used a doppelganger in place to fool the daughter Lisa, but it didn't work. Lisa was much more reactive to the experiments than her mother and was used as a guinea pig for 28 years. With pretty much any virus or experiment being used on her, to the point that her mental state completely deteriorated. This backfired on the people behind the experiment though, as they had accidentally created a super powerful being that could regenerate and had immense strength. She was nearly indestructible. Eventually, this led to her killing some researchers when her mind slowly started to come back, and she eventually escaped and lived in the nearby mountains. You then encounter Lisa in the game, and she cannot die, even with the infinite rocket launcher. And she does an insane amount of damage. You can also find notes from the last few moments when she still had her sanity, expressing her desire to be reunited with her mother. You then have a boss fight with her, where she's trying to open her mother's grave, as it's the closest thing she'll get to being with her mother again. This is the best addition the remake adds to the story, as it really highlights how despicable Umbrella is, and it makes you hate Wesker even more knowing that he was involved in this. An innocent family was completely torn apart and ruined by bioweapon research. It's why I'm kind of torn on which game's story I prefer. I do really love the campy tone and style of the original, but I also do like the new backstory with the Trevor family and the more fleshed out Spencer experiments. Both games are entertaining regardless, but for different reasons. In terms of the endings, there's 12 as stated previously. In the game, it's possible to save the other protagonist or leave them to die, and your partner also has similar options. For example, when playing as Jill, Barry is your partner for that campaign and Chris is locked up in the lab. For Chris, Rebecca is his partner and Jill is locked up in the lab. Both Rebecca and Barry have situations where they can die during the game. Both characters have 6 endings as a result of this, and it goes something like this. Bad ending 1, both the other protagonist and your partner are left to die, therefore the second fight with Tyrant on the helipad doesn't happen. Bad ending 2, you saved the other protagonist, but your partner was left to die, therefore the second fight with Tyrant doesn't happen. Alternate ending 1, the other protagonist is left to die and your partner is killed by Tyrant during the second battle. Alternate ending 2, the other protagonist is saved, but your partner dies during the second Tyrant fight. Alternate ending 3, the other protagonist is left to die, but your partner survives the second Tyrant fight, or the good ending in which they both live. Resident Evil used to have multiple endings, and it added a lot of replay value to the game to see the different story events and endings. The hilarious thing about this though is that there is absolutely no way to obtain the canon ending in either game. Canonically, Chris, Jill, Barry and Rebecca all escape the mansion. But there's no way to get this ending. Rebecca just doesn't exist in Jill's campaign to begin with, and so you can only save Chris and Barry. And in Chris's campaign, Barry dips after the opening cutscene and is never seen again. In fact, it's implied he died, so you can only save Jill and Rebecca. But I decided to be a bit funny, and with the power of editing, I can edit together the canonical ending of Resident Evil 1. And here's the remake version if you want it. Overall though, both games are entertaining and have plenty of replay value to see different parts of the story. It's not Shakespeare by any means, but you'll have a good time. Overall though, Resident Evil is still a pretty solid game all these years later. There is some jank with the controls, some enemies can be annoying, and the cave section is pretty weak, but it's still a game with some of the best level design in survival horror history, and the gameplay mechanics and structure still hold up for the most part. Plus the music and characters have become iconic mainstays in gaming, and whatever your favorite Resident Evil game is, it would not have existed without this classic. The remake for me is classic Resident Evil gameplay at its peak. It captures almost everything I love about the original game, whilst adding and improving elements to make it stand out from the original, and to make the visit to the Spencer Mansion a more memorable experience. I love the 1996 original, but the 2002 game is one I would die for. It's my personal favorite entry in this entire franchise, and I never get bored of it. For this video alone, I did 11 playthroughs of Resident Evil 1 Remake. I only did 5 or 6 for the original by comparison. Resident Evil 1 Remake is a genuine masterpiece, and very few survival horror games have managed to match its qualities or replayability in the decades since its release. What does disappoint me, though, is Capcom's attitudes towards the remake. Since 2002, the remake has been considered the definitive version of Resident Evil 1, and as such, the original 1996 game has been mostly ignored, only really getting a DS port. And to me, this sucks. Whilst I do prefer the remake, and it did have some of the same creative minds behind it, a remake should never be treated as a replacement by its publishers. To treat the remake as a software update and the original as an out-of-date relic is a slap in the face to the idea of video games ever being considered art. If games are treated the same way Windows updates are, then video games could never possibly be art. They're disposable toys at that point. Since Resident Evil 1 is not available for modern systems, your only options are to either 1. Get the original hardware the game was released on, and fork over money for that, 2. Emulate it, or 3. Buy the remake. But the problem is that the 2002 game titled Resident Evil is not the 1996 game titled Resident Evil. They might be similar in a lot of ways, but they are not the same game, and to pretend that they are, and this is the definitive version, is ludicrous. Most people will opt for the third option because it's the most convenient. By narrowing the customer's options, it means that you are essentially erasing the game from history. I know some people might say that software and hardware have expiration dates regardless, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't try to preserve it for as long as possible. Humans don't live forever, and we still try and live for as long as we possibly can, so why should art be treated any differently? Video games have had preservation issues for a long time, and it only gets worse and worse as the years go on. I believe Capcom should do a full re-release of the game on modern systems to allow people to play it. If you're not a PC gamer and only play on consoles, it gets even worse because it's likely that your only option is the remake. You don't even have to like the game or care about this series to agree with me on this. If you care about games as a medium and as an art form, and I mean genuinely care, you'll see eye to eye on this. Resident Evil 1 should get a re-release. This game is responsible for this entire franchise existing, and as such, it should be shown more respect by its parents. Also, yes, I am aware of the re-release on GOG, but the point I made about the game's availability on consoles still remains. Still, it's nice that they took the time and effort to touch up the game and make it more accessible.